Hello and welcome to another Energy Chat brought to you by the energycollective.com. On Tuesday, President Obama delivered a much anticipated speech outlining the president's new strategy to address the threats posed by climate change. In his Georgetown University address and in a companion fact sheet released by the White House, President Obama outlined a range of measures to help cut greenhouse gas emissions and, crucially, to prepare for the impacts of an already warming world. For the Energy Collective, I'm Jesse Jenkins, and here to talk about the President's big climate speech with us is Matthew Stepp, author of the Energy Collective's new Capital Energy Report column, and a senior policy analyst at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation in Washington, D.C. Matt, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Jesse, for having me.
So to start with, why don't you give us the highlights from the President's speech and his new climate plan? What were the big takeaways for you?
Sure. There are three big takeaways. The president announced a national climate initiative for reducing carbon emissions through EPA standards on new and existing coal power plants. He called for a really aggressive national initiative to build climate resilient infrastructure to really prepare us, I think, for the really harsh impacts of climate change, that what we're seeing today as well as what we expect in the future. And then he also called for, I think, a really a more detailed look at what we can do at the international level, particularly when it comes to non-CO2 emissions, things like hydrofluorocarbons, and what we can do in bilateral and multilateral agreements there. So it was a really wide-ranging speech. He really did some really old-school, traditional environmental calls for kind of making that emotional connection between the children and the future and what we can do to mitigate climate change. It read more like a speech you would hear from the 70s, 80s, early 90s than what we've traditionally heard from the president when it comes to climate change. So it was a very interesting and, I think, important speech.
So maybe we'll start a little bit with the tone and rhetoric of the speech, which you mentioned were kind of new from the president, before we move on to some of the details of the policies. So you said he really framed this much more like a traditional environmental speech. I think in past State of the Union addresses in particular, he's focused more on the opportunities posed by developing clean energy technologies for our energy security or our economy. What do you think marks the departure here for the president, and how do you think that'll affect the likelihood of policies proposed in this speech?
Right. I think the real departure is that he didn't really mention at all many, or if at any, of the initiatives that he's proposed or enacted in the past that he is directly linked to his climate and energy policies. So things like the Energy Security Trust or the economic benefits of deploying more clean energy were largely absent from the speech. Instead, I think he got down to the gritty of just connecting it to that visceral emotional reaction of just, we need to do this as quickly as possible, and he's going to do this in whatever way he can, recognizing that Congress is essentially going to remain silent, at least for the foreseeable future.
So maybe a new start on climate for the president. One of the other interesting notes is that instead of the sort of sweeping cap and trade policy and the sort of omnibus bill that was debated in 2009 in the U.S. Senate and House, this is really a scattershot of a number of different initiatives, as you said, that the president can try to pursue with administrative authority outside of Congress. Is this sort of a shift from a big top-down push to a much more kind of piecemeal but possibly more pragmatic effort to just move the ball forward wherever he can?
I think that's absolutely right. So he's implementing different policies depending on the energy sector he wants to reduce emissions from. So he talked about setting fuel efficiency standards for heavy-duty vehicles, something that the United States has never done. And he recently increased the fuel efficiency standards for light-duty vehicles up to a record of 54.5 miles per gallon by 2025. So he wants to do the same for heavy-duty vehicles. And then the aforementioned emission standards on coal plants, essentially on power plants, which in his mind take care of the electricity sector, which represents about 40% of U.S. emissions. So he's definitely taking things on individually. He had a lot in the speech on energy efficiency, particularly he highlighted his building efficiency program in an effort, in his mind, I would imagine, in an effort to deal with more the industry and residential side of emissions and their energy demand.
So let's talk about the big chunk of emissions from the power sector, and probably the most high-profile set of policies that were discussed in the speech and in a related White House fact sheet, and that's regulation of power plant emissions, particularly from coal plants. The EPA has been working on regulations for new power plants to limit their emissions of CO2 below a certain performance standard, and the president indicated in this speech that he would prompt the EPA to extend those regulations to existing power plants as well. Tell me about that plan and where that's going to go from here.
Yeah, the basics is that what the president wants is EPA to kind of come up with its draft regulations by 2014, with the idea that then they would be implemented by 2015. But I think the understanding, of course, is that the EPA is having, I think, significant trouble just getting the original new power plant standards implemented. There's currently, I think, a court battle going on, depending on how they define certain things in that regulation, and EPA's missed a number of deadlines. So at the earliest, we can assume 2015. I know I've seen a number of experts posit, on the web and elsewhere, that at the minimum we're probably looking at a 5-year period, 2018 or so forth, before we could see, I think, any tangible regulations on the electricity sector.
So I guess one of the advantages of the president acting through administrative authority is you don't have to wait for Congress, but the downside then is that you run into the court battles and kind of protracted fights over EPA regulation, pushing the timeline down the road. I imagine that the uncertainty created by the push for those regulations would deter investors in new coal-fired power plants in the meantime, but is the timing of this setting it up for, I think, an important electoral fight in the 2016 elections to ensure that the legacy started here by President Obama is fully enacted on the sort of 2016 and beyond time frame that you mentioned?
Absolutely. I think this is going to be a key battle in the 2014 midterm elections. Is going to be a key battle in the 2016 presidential elections. And I think that in the near term, I think what this will is create enough uncertainty where a utility may just automatically switch to, say, natural gas instead of expanding its coal, and so that in the short term, even without regulations, could have some small benefits. But I think the real story about kind of his executive actions is that he's essentially recognizing that there's no way that he can individually make drastic reductions in carbon emissions without the help of Congress. Even if you add up all of these policies, we're looking at best modest emissions in the 5, 10, 15-year time frame. Mm-hmm. So I think he's recognizing his limited abilities, but he's going to do everything he can to essentially try to do as much as he can within his legacy period the next couple of years.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, it's a lot of kind of incremental pushes on energy efficiency, and also continuing a trend that's been underway of transitioning from coal to natural gas in the power sector, which is helping drive down U.S. emissions. The efficiency gains in the automotive sector already have helped push down consumption of oil. But of course, ultimately in the long run, what we're going to need are really truly zero carbon alternatives to all fossil fuels. And as Justin Gillis at the New York Times writes in response to the president's address, modest reductions already achieved in the United States and other Western countries are being swamped by rising emissions from the East. So the real question is whether technologies can be developed and then deployed worldwide that allow for continued economic growth and rising energy use with minimal greenhouse gas emissions. So I think that brings us back to a topic pretty close to your heart, Matt, and that's innovation. One of the things that was largely absent from the speech, I gather, was a discussion of many of the kind of innovation initiatives that he's implemented in the past to try to develop those clean, scalable, and affordable low-carbon technologies that would be needed to, as Gillis puts it, sort of reduce that trade-off between economic growth and energy use worldwide and greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. So innovation was essentially missing from the speech. Now, if you dive into the white paper that the White House released along with the speech, there is a few instances of innovation-related policies. For example, he calls for roughly $3 billion more in investments in clean energy research and development. He wants to implement.
Can you put that number in context for us?
So the United States, at least in FY13, invests about $5 billion in clean energy research and development. At the height of the stimulus, we were right around $7–8 billion, so that has come down since the stimulus, and the president's essentially proposing to boost that back up to stimulus levels. And this is about, if you reach the $8 billion number, you'd be about about 50% of what most experts would say is the necessary level of public investment in clean energy research and development. So it's certainly a big number, and I applaud the president for noting it. I wish he actually talked a little more about it in his speech itself. But at least in the plan, it is to increase it by $3 billion, and of course he needs Congress to do that. So it's not something he can tangibly do himself. But on the other hand, he did call for an increase in demonstration and deployment of clean energy on public lands, which I think is a significant policy that offers the opportunity to test and demonstrate new and emerging designs for different clean energy technologies and solar and wind. He wants to get upwards of 20% of federal electricity from clean energy. I think that's a laudable goal, and I think that would help innovation. And then there's a lot of really nuanced bureaucratic innovation policies in there. He wants to implement a quadrennial energy review, which would actually coordinate all of these innovation and energy programs across agencies, something we don't naturally do today. And there's obviously would never make it into a big presidential speech. They're boring, they're nuanced, but they're important nonetheless. But on the whole, if you add up all of those policies, it's certainly not an aggressive or cohesive innovation approach. In many ways, I think he's recognizing that without Congress, we really can't implement an aggressive innovation policy.
Thanks. Well, let's talk a little bit about adaptation and resilience efforts. There was a lot of the speech about preparing for the impacts that we're already seeing or are going to see, particularly over the life of the infrastructure we're building today. What did the president propose to help prepare us for the impacts of climate change?
I thought one of the most exciting things he proposed was taking the Hurricane Sandy areas that were impacted and actually implementing pilot programs for building climate resilient infrastructure and preparedness projects. And I think that's really interesting. That would be a good way of trying to test what works and what doesn't work and what we can then take and implement throughout the rest of the countries. And I think it's great to use an area that's most prominently hit by what many believe a climate impacted weather event. So I think that's a really strong step forward, and obviously the devil is in the follow-through. We then have to take those pilots and then do something with it, but I think that's a really good step and something that the United States just hasn't done yet.
So at this stage, it's sort of about exploring what our options are, other than a sort of wholesale change in the way we manage our infrastructure?
I think so. I mean, there is a lot in the plan about changing the way the federal government views its things like flood insurance and investments in infrastructure to take into account climate change and the impacts of extreme weather. So I think what we're going to see over time is they're going to start to change the rules so there's actual climate metrics in how this decision making takes place. Those are going to take a little bit of time. That's not an immediate thing. I think the pilot projects in the long term might have the most immediate tangible results, but certainly for when it comes to anything that deals with the federal government, climate change, at least based off of the climate plan, is going to have a much bigger impact.
So I know a number of states have looked at this in the past, begun to start to plan for climate impacts, but now the federal government seems to be on board and taking climate into account when we're planning for the future. Well, thanks, Matt. I don't know if you have anything else you'd like to add, but I appreciate the run-through of the President's climate speech and his new strategy.
No, this is great. Thanks a lot.
Great. Thank you.